This is the EVP Podcast.
Welcome back to the EVP Podcast, where we explore the eerie, the haunted, and the horrifying. I'm Beaker.
And I'm Ghosty. Tonight's episode isn't for the faint of heart. We're diving deep, skin deep, into the life and legacy of Ed Gein.
The real-life inspiration for Hollywood's most chilling characters, Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Buffalo Bill. But the truth is far more disturbing.
We'll trace Gein's disturbing upbringing, the macabre crimes, the trial, his death, and the paranormal echoes that still linger in Plainfield, Wisconsin.
Ed Gein's story begins in 1906 in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. He was born Edward Theodore Gein on August 27th to George and Augusta Gein. He was the younger of two sons, his brother Henry being the elder. At first glance, this may seem like a relatively normally family, but as we'll see, Ed's upbringing would be anything but typical.
So Ed's father, George Gein, was a violent alcoholic man. He struggled to keep a steady job, and the family lived in poverty for most of Ed's early life. In stark contrast, Augusta, Ed's mother, was domineering, fanatical in her religious beliefs, and fiercely protective of her children, especially Ed. Her worldview was based on an extreme interpretation of the Bible, and she taught her sons to fear the outside world, seeing it as a place of sin and damnation.
Augusta's influence over Ed was immense. From a young age, Ed was indoctrinated into his mother's worldview. Augusta saw women as inherently evil and the root of all sin. This belief would play a central role in shaping Ed's perception of women throughout his life. His relationship with his mother was complex. While he seemed to be in awe of her, he was also deeply dependent on her approval and validation.
So Augusta's religious fervor extended beyond just teaching her sons her views. She was fiercely controlling. Ed and Henry were isolated from other children and were not allowed to socialize or participate in any community activities. Their education was mostly confined to Augusta's lessons, which centered on the Bible with her own beliefs about morality and sin.
There were few exceptions in Ed's life when it came to breaking his mother's rules. His strict upbringing created a deeply introverted and awkward young boy. Ed was teased mercilessly at school for his unusual mannerisms. He was often described as socially inept, with strange laughter or sudden outbursts that caused his peers to avoid him. He seemed more comfortable in his own world than in the real one, a world shaped by his mother's overbearing presence.
So Ed's bond with Augusta was unlike any normal mother-son relationship. He viewed her as a saint, someone whose word was absolute. Even as a young adult, Ed would have been incredibly reliant on his mother's approval. Augusta's control over him only intensified as he grew older. Her disdain for women left Ed with no real connection to any female figure outside of his mother. He was isolated, and this isolation set the stage for what was to come.
When Ed's father, George, died of heart failure in 1940, things didn't improve. Ed and Henry were left to run the family farm, and while Henry had aspirations of getting out and starting his own life, Ed remained rooted to the farm, caring for Augusta and carrying out her wishes. It is said that Augusta was a constant presence in Ed's life, even in death, and after George's passing, she took on an even more commanding role.
So Ed's older brother, Henry, had begun to push back against Augusta's control. He was frustrated with her isolation and began dating a local woman, something that Augusta didn't approve of. Henry had dreams of escaping their mother's grip, but it wasn't to be.
Now, in 1944, a strange incident occurred that would change Ed's life forever. A fire broke out on the farm, and Ed and Henry were out fighting it together. When the fire was put out, Henry was nowhere to be found. Ed later led authorities to Henry's body, which was found on the farm.
So it's here that the circumstances surrounding Henry's death become questionable. The official cause was asphyxiation. There it goes. So it was asphyxiation from smoke inhalation.
Good job.
But some of the reports indicated that Henry's body showed signs of trauma. bruises to the head that didn't match the theory of a simple fire-related death. Yet no autopsy was conducted, and Henry's death was ruled an accident.
So there are theories abound that Henry may have had a confrontation with Ed. Now, he was the only person who had ever stood up to Augusta and Ed. Augusta and Ed. He's the only one that stood up to Augusta and Ed. And some believe that Ed may have, in a fit of rage or confusion, killed his brother. It would make sense considering Ed's growing attachment to his mother and his tendency to remove anyone who challenged her influence over him.
So after Henry's death, Ed's mental state deteriorated. Augusta, who had been a stern but constant figure in his life, suffered a stroke soon after Henry's death and died in 1945. So Ed was now completely alone. The loss of his mother, which was the last link to his twisted world, sent him into a psychological tailspin.
Ed had always lived in her shadow, and after her death, he boarded up a room, keeping it exactly as it had been when she was alive. He spent days locked away in the house, staring at the room, obsessing over the loss. As he withdrew further from the world, the house itself began to decay, reflecting Ed's own unraveling mind.
So this is where Ed Gein's descent into madness truly begins. Alone, isolated, and with no one to answer to, he turned inward. The loss of his mother left an emotional void that he could not fill. It was during this time that Ed began to delve into the darker aspects of the human mind. He read books of anatomy, the occult, and even the Nazi medical experiments. His obsession with death and transformation grew, and he began to collect human body parts. It was also around this time that he started to visit local cemeteries.
Now, the isolated farm, once a place of family life, would soon become a house of horrors. But
Horrors?
that's horrors. Horrors.
Horrors. A house of horrors.
But that's a story for later.
Oh, perfect.
We'll get into that.
Can't wait.
For now, Ed's early years set the foundation for the twisted path he would eventually follow. The trauma from his upbringing, his deep, unresolved attachment to his mother, and the isolation he endured all combined to create a ticking time bomb. The question wasn't if it would crack, it was when.
Dun, dun, dun. So on to the crimes. So after the death of his mother, Ed Gein was left in a world that seemed even more alien than before. For years, he had lived under her oppressive rule, but with her passing, he became entirely untethered. It was during this time of isolation that Ed began to delve into the darker aspects of life, obsessing over death, decay, and what lay beneath the surface of human existence.
Now, Ed's obsession with death and the human body began to manifest itself in disturbing ways. He started to visit local cemeteries and exhuming corpses. His fascination with anatomy and the occult fueled his belief that he could transform his body, specifically into a woman. But this wasn't just about grave robbing for a few bones or trinkets. Ed was after something much more grotesque: body parts.
So between 1947 and 1952, Ed made nightly excursions to several local cemeteries in Plainfield and surrounding areas. He used obituaries to find recently deceased women who resembled his mother, women who were middle-aged and in Ed's eyes pure. He believed that by digging up their bodies, he could bring them back to life, in a sense, and that he could wear their skin, transforming himself into a new identity, a twisted version of resurrection.
He would visit these graves under the cover of night. Sometimes he would go for a single body part. Other times, he would take the entire corpse, removing heads, limbs, and skin. Once he had obtained his trophies, Ed would return to his farm and begin his grisly work. He meticulously skinned the bodies, tanning the skin and preserving the bones.
So what's even more disturbing in the level of craftsmanship Ed exhibited in his work, the skin he stripped from his victims was often turned into bizarre household items. He made furniture out of the body parts, using skulls as bedposts, and in one case even crafted a lampshade from human skin, a seat cushion upholstered with human flesh, leggings, and a vest made from skin. These were just a few of the macabre creations he ended up filling his house with.
And one of the most chilling items found in the home was a mask he created from the face of a dead woman. The mask, made from the skin of a decapitated body, was said to have been worn by Ed when he was attempting to become a woman. Some accounts suggested that Ed would wear the mask during his late-night rituals, dancing around in a strange, trance-like state, lost in his delusions.
Like Buffalo. Yeah, I can see that.
Exactly.
So Ed's fascination with his mother's death didn't stop at grave robbing. His obsession extended into the need for transformation, a desire to fill the emotional void that Augusta's passing had left in him. In his warped mind, wearing the skin of others and becoming his mother was the only way he could feel whole again. It was almost as if it was trying to merge his identity with hers, to live through her once more.
But the disturbing nature of Ed's crimes didn't stop with exhumations of body parts. In 1954, a woman named Mary Hogan, who was a local tavern owner, disappeared without a trace. It wasn't until later that the authorities would piece together Ed's involvement. He'd killed her, shot her in the face, and dragged her body back to his farm, where he would later preserve her face and skull.
At the time, no one thought Ed was involved. He was a quiet, eccentric figure, but no one saw him as a threat. In fact, he had a reputation as being harmless, just an odd man who kept to himself. But when Mary's disappearance remained unsolved, Ed casually mentioned her to people in town, even joking about her being at his house. No one took him seriously, but it was soon revealed that Ed had, in fact, killed Mary Hogan, and this wasn't the first time.
And then in 1957 came the disappearance of Bernice Warden, a local hardware store owner. Ed had been in her shop the day she vanished, and it was the last time anyone saw her alive. The following day, her son, Deputy Frank Warden, went to Ed's farm to ask about his mother. Ed, strangely calm, invited him inside. That's when police discovered the horrific truth.
In Ed's barn, they found Bernice Warden's body, hanging upside down by her feet, gutted like an animal. Her head was in a box, and her organs were neatly removed and set aside. The sheer brutality of this crime was unlike anything investigators had seen before. It wasn't just a murder, it was a ritualistic act, a horrifying display of control, violence, and psychological degradation.
But that wasn't all. Inside of Ed's house, authorities found evidence of his deep psychological obsession with death. Mary Hogan's face was found stuffed in a paper bag. There were skulls used as bedposts and bowls. The body parts that had been meticulously preserved and turned into functional items were beyond anything law enforcement could have anticipated. One of the most disturbing discoveries was a corset made from a female torso, stripped of its skin, and a pair of lips fashioned into a drawstring for a bag.
Oh, man. In addition to the obvious items, investigators found a collection of human organs, bones, and other body parts. These weren't just scattered randomly, they were organized in a way that suggested purpose and intent. Some of these body parts were kept in Ed's refrigerator, others were tucked away in boxes around the house, meticulously preserved. His home was in every sense a macabre museum to death.
It is believed that Ed's crimes were driven by more than just a twisted desire to keep his trophies. He was attempting to create something that could bring his mother back, even if in a grotesque form. By collecting and preserving body parts, he sought to control death and to fill emotional void that his mother's death had left behind. His warped view of women, coupled with his intense attachment to his mother, made these acts of violence both deeply personal and disturbing.
And the final horrific discovery was that Ed had been using these body parts to create a woman's suit. He had sewn together various body parts, skin, bones, and even internal organs into a grotesque outfit that he would wear at night. This wasn't just for physical transformation, it was, in his mind, a way of becoming his mother. It's been suggested that Ed would wear this suit and dance around in his barn, pretending to be the woman he could never be, trying to live out a fantasy that just had consumed him.
That's insane. Now, the police were stunned by the sheer level of depravity and madness that they uncovered on Ed's farm. Now, what made it even more disturbing was that he showed no real signs of remorse. In fact, Ed's demeanor was calm and almost detached, as if he had justified his actions in some twisted way. When asked about the bodies and the body parts, he spoke casually, almost as if he were discussing something ordinary.
So the crime scene was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. A simple rural farmhouse had become a house of horrors. It wasn't just murder. It was a psychological descent into madness, an obsessive need to control death, and a twisted effort to preserve his mother's influence in the most grotesque way possible. To truly understand Ed Gein, we need to step beyond the grotesque crimes and examine the fractured psyche of the man behind the terror. What drove him to do the unthinkable? What psychological and emotional forces were at play?
Ed Gein's case is often studied by psychologists and criminologists because of the bizarre and disturbing nature of his crimes. But to fully comprehend the depths of his actions, we need to understand his upbringing, his relationship with his mother, and how his isolation and mental instability culminated in murder.
So first and foremost, Ed's formative years were riddled with trauma, and the relationship he had with his mother Augusta was undeniably the most influential factor in shaping the warped psyche. Augusta was an incredibly controlling and fanatical figure, a religious zealot who instilled in Ed the belief that women were evil and sexual desire was sinful, and that the world was a corrupt and wicked place.
So I know it sounds like we're going to be going over some of the stuff that we've already talked about, but it just kind of brings to
Everything
the point.
full circle.
It kind of just brings, it just drives it home how important his relationship with his mother was into what he became, right?
Yeah. Crazy.
So she had actually kept Ed and her brother isolated on the farm, like we mentioned, away from the corrupting influences of society. Now, Augusta had also taught him that the only way to achieve salvation was through a strict and pious existence. She turned Ed into someone who viewed the world through her extreme lens, which is a lens of purity and sin, good and evil, with no room for nuance.
So Ed, who was naturally introverted and awkward, never had the chance to develop normal social relationships. He was completely under his mother's control, physically, emotionally, and mentally. She was his moral compass, his guide, and his only connection to the world. This stunted his emotional development, and as he grew older, Ed became more and more dependent on his mother's teachings and approval.
Now, as we mentioned earlier, when his brother Henry died, Ed's sense of attachment to Augusta intensified. His mother had always been the center of his universe, and after her passing, he was left in a deep emotional void. His mother's death was devastating to Ed, but more than that, it was a complete disintegration of the worldview she had built for him.
Though that void left Ed with no clear sense of identity. Without Augusta, he lost his anchor in the world. It's possible that Ed, unable to reconcile the loss, began to create a new warped version of reality, one where he could bring his mother back, not just in memory, but in physical form. This was the beginning of his delusional quest to resurrect Augusta through the skins of other women.
Now, Ed's relationship with his mother was more than just emotional. There was almost an incestuous element to it. Augusta was not just a strict religious figure in his life. She was his sole source of validation, and Ed had no real understanding of how to relate to other women. He viewed them as threats, as sinful beings, in line with his mother's teachings. Yet at the same time, he was obsessed with them, and he couldn't reconcile his feelings of anger and desire.
So this created a perfect storm in Ed's mind. His mother taught him to hate women, but he was simultaneously fascinated by them, particularly older women who resembled her. He was drawn to them because they represented both the good and the evil in his life. In his delusional mind, these women were his key to becoming something that could finally make him feel whole again.
But it wasn't just about bringing his mother back to life in a physical sense. The act of killing and preserving women or wearing their skin was Ed's way of assuming a new identity. He became obsessed with the idea of transformation. By wearing the skin of these women, he believed he could become his mother, or perhaps, in his mind, he was finally able to free her from the constraints of death.
So the psychological concept of gender dysphoria comes into play here. As well, Ed may have been struggling with his own gender identity. He was often reported as having confused, disjointed feelings toward both masculinity and femininity. His creation of the women's suit could have been a misguided attempt to reconcile this inner conflict, as he could not distinguish his own desires from his fantasies.
In his mind, the transformation wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Wearing the woman's suit gave Ed a sense of power and control that he had never felt before. It allowed him to step into the role of the woman he had idolized, the one who could be pure, untouched by sin, and the person who would never leave him.
But beyond gender identity or transformation, there's also the deeply rooted necrophilic aspect of Ed's psyche. His fixation on the dead bodies isn't just about death for death's sake. It's about control. Dead bodies don't reject you, they don't criticize you, and they don't leave. Ed saw death as an escape from the harshness of his reality, a place where he could maintain control not just over his victims, but over his own psychological state.
Ed's necrophiliac tendencies also tie into the way he viewed death as a means of preserving the perfect form of a woman, one that could never disappoint him. In his deranged state, he didn't want to deal with the complexities of a real relationship. He wanted to create a version of his mother and other women that couldn't leave him, couldn't criticize him, and couldn't be corrupted by the world. He wasn't interested in sexual relationships or typical human intimacy. He wanted domination over death and memory itself.
So what makes Ed's psychology even more chilling is the complete lack of remorse he showed for his actions. In interviews, he often spoke about his crimes in a calm, detached manner, as though he wasn't fully aware of the horror he had unleashed. Some experts believe this shows his complete disassociation from reality, almost as if he were living in a parallel world where his actions were justified by his delusions.
The fact that he could engage in such grisly acts with minimal emotional response suggests that Ed was deeply disconnected from the consequences of his actions. His delusions made it hard for him to distinguish between right and wrong. Instead, he acted according to a twisted moral framework that was entirely shaped by the teachings of his mother.
So Ed was also diagnosed with schizophrenia, a mental illness that can cause a complete break from reality. This, combined with his intense isolation, warped sense of morality, and unhealthy attachment to his mother, created the perfect storm for his grotesque behaviors.
Now, it is important to note that Ed's crimes were not random acts of violence. They were deeply personal. Each body part, each piece of preserved flesh was a symbol of his distorted relationship with his mother. It wasn't just about the act of murder. It was about recreating his own sense of identity and his relationship with Augusta, even after death.
So in a way, Ed's crimes were both a product of his extreme upbringing and a psychological spiral that turned his fantasies into a nightmarish reality. His mother had taught him that the world was evil, that women were to be feared and controlled, and Ed internalized these beliefs to the point of madness.
So, when we look at Ed Gein, we don't just see a serial killer. We see a man whose actions were driven by a deep psychological wounds, a warped relationship with his mother, and a desire to control death and life. His crimes were a tragic and horrifying manifestation of a mind utterly broken by isolation, trauma, and delusion.
And the truly terrifying thing about Ed Gein is how he was able to hide in plain sight for so long. The quiet, reclusive man who kept to himself, never making waves in the community, no one suspected the horrors he was capable of. He lived a double life, crafting macabre treasures from the dead, while maintaining the facade of a harmless, eccentric loner. So after the shocking discovery of Bernice Warden's body and the horrors uncovered at Ed Gein's farmhouse, the legal system had to face a deeply uncomfortable question. Was Ed Gein even sane enough to stand trial?
That's right. When Ed Gein was arrested in 1957, he was initially charged with one count of first-degree murder, the killing of Bernice Warden. but investigators believe he was likely responsible for the death of Mary Hogan and possibly others, even though no additional charges were filed. Why? Because what followed wasn't your typical murder trial. It became a legal and psychological odyssey.
So Ed underwent a psychiatric evaluation shortly after his arrest, and unsurprisingly, doctors found him mentally unfit to stand trial. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and declared legally insane. Because of this, Ed was committed to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, later known as Dodge Correctional Institution, in Waupun, Wisconsin.
Now, there he lived in a locked psychiatric ward rather than in a prison cell. He wasn't treated like a hardened criminal, but rather a deeply disturbed man who couldn't fully comprehend the nature of his crimes. Over the years, he was reportedly a model patient, quiet, cooperative, and surprisingly well-behaved. Staff often noted how polite and even gentle he was, despite his horrifying past.
But the story doesn't end there. In 1968, more than a decade after his initial arrest, doctors determined that Ed Gein was finally competent to stand trial. That's when things got back into the courtroom, and his long-delayed legal proceedings resumed.
The trial was held in June 1968 and lasted only a week. Ed waived his right to a jury, so the verdict was handed down by a judge. He was tried only for the murder of Bernice Worden, even though evidence heavily suggested his involvement in Mary Hogan's disappearance.
So during the trial, his defense once again leaned on his mental illness, while prosecutors focused on proving that Ed understood the criminality of his actions, at least at the time of the murder. But ultimately, Judge Robert H. Gallmar found Ed Gein not guilty by reason of insanity.
Now, instead of prison, Ed was recommitted to a psychiatric facility, this time to Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin, where he would live out the rest of his days. And that's where the spotlight on Ed faded. He remained institutionalized for the next 15 years, largely forgotten by the public.
So reports from Mendota say that he was quiet and compliant. He spent his days reading, doing simple chores, and maintaining a low profile. Despite the infamy of his crimes, Ed Gein reportedly lived a relatively uneventful existence behind the walls of the hospital.
And do you know what's eerie?
What is?
By all accounts, Ed never showed remorse for what he did. Not in the way we think of it. He didn't rage. He didn't grieve. He just accepted his fate with a calm detachment. It was like he never fully understood the horror of his own actions. Horror of his own actions.
So he died on July 26 of 1984 from complications related to cancer. He was 77 years old and was buried in Plainfield Cemetery, the same resting place as many of his victims, including his own family. Ironically, his grave became a target for vandalism and theft. His headstone was even stolen in 2000.
Now, Ed Gein's trial and institutionalization raised some unsettling questions. When someone commits atrocities so horrifying that they seem beyond reason, how do we treat them? As criminals, as patients, or as monsters?
The legal system didn't see Gein as someone who needed punishment. It saw him as someone who needed treatment. And that distinction in this case still sparks debate today. Was justice truly served, or was Ed Gein a man so broken that he never stood a chance to begin with?
Now, the name Ed Gein has reverberated through horror culture like a twisted echo. From Norman Bates to Leatherface, Gein's grisly legacy has influenced characters that blur the line between human and monster. But his legacy isn't just one of fear, it's one of darkness that still lingers in Plainfield, Wisconsin.
So Plainfield, this quiet rural town, a place that holds secrets beneath the soil. When people talk about Ed Gein now, it's as if they're whispering about more than just a murderer. They're talking about something that still feels wrong with that land. The air is thick, and the past doesn't just live in old newspaper clippings or courtroom transcripts. It lives in the soil.
The Gein house was the epicenter of his twisted world, and when it burned down in 1958, the flames didn't just destroy a building. that engulfs something much darker. Locals will tell you that there's a palpable sense of unease in the area where the house once stood. Some say it's even cursed.
One of the most chilling reports comes from paranormal investigators who have visited the site. They describe feeling watched, a sensation that tightens the chest and sends a chill down the spine. Apparitions have been seen flickering in the shadows at dusks. Others claim to hear faint whispers, almost like the voices of the dead Gein left behind.
And that's just the start. Gein's grave has been a focal point for paranormal activity too. Since his death, people have reported hearing distant, echoing laughter near the cemetery. Others have felt a cold wind in areas of the graveyard where no breeze should be. Some believe it's Ed himself, his restless spirit, tethered to the land that he once hunted in life.
And then
haunted?
There were
the ones that he haunted in life. Yes. Not hunted, haunted.
Haunted.
Yes.
Hunted.
Hunted. Haunted?
Ghost hunted.
He haunted.
And then there were the stories about the cemetery itself. Some visitors claim they've seen figures moving between the gravestones, but when they approach, there's nothing there. Others feel an overwhelming sadness when standing near Ed's plot. It's as if the souls of the women he murdered never truly left, bound by their connection to him, to his twisted rituals.
So like we mentioned in 2000, the headstone marking Ed's grave was stolen, likely as a macabre trophy by someone trying to own a piece of his gruesome history. It was recovered, but not before the act became part of the town's ongoing eerie narrative. Some say that the theft of the headstone was just another chapter in the story, a reminder that Ed's hold over Plainfield wasn't easily broken.
In fact, some believe that the curse is tied to the land itself. Could it be that Ed's preserve actions left a psychic stain, something that goes beyond a mere haunted house? Paranormal researchers suggest that places of deep trauma, like the Gein property, can become a hotspot for residual energy where the spirits of the tormented leave an indelible mark on the environment.
Now, even the simple act of walking through Plainfield can trigger strange sensations. One investigator claimed that while in the area, they felt an unshakable feeling of dread, like being followed by unseen eyes. Another visitor reported hearing footsteps behind them despite being alone on a desolate road.
And it doesn't stop there. The Gein legend continues to influence modern-day horror, not just through fictional works, but through what's claimed to be real-life encounters with the paranormal. In the world of urban legends and haunted tales, the spirit of Ed Gein has become a boogeyman, a lingering shadow that reminds us of how close the line between horror and reality can be.
It's no wonder that Ed Gein remains so deeply ingrained in the cultural psyche. He transcended the role of just a killer. He became something more. The kind of figure who, even in death, pulls the strings of imagination, sending shivers down your spine when you least expect it.
Some even say the spirit of Ed is a permanent fixture of sorts, a dark guardian of Plainfield. Whether it's a piece of folklore or a deeply... Oh, I just totally lost that. I'm going to start that part over.
Okay.
Some even say that the spirit of Ed is a permanent fixture of sorts, a dark guardian of Plainfield. Whether it's a piece of folklore or a deeply buried truth, people claim that a shadow in the town follows them, particularly in areas near his farm and grave. There's a definite sense of unease, an unspoken recognition that something still haunts the place.
Now, in the end, the question remains, is Ed Gein's legacy simply the stuff of nightmares? Or is it a haunting presence that never truly left Plainfield? From the cursed land to the lingering paranormal reports, one thing's for certain, Ed Gein's story is far from over. Now, it is hard to think of a killer more iconic than Ed Gein. His influence stretches far beyond the confines of criminal history and into the very fabric of pop culture. He didn't just inspire fictional villains, he became a symbol of everything grotesque, macabre, and disturbing. His legacy lives on in countless movies, books, and television shows. But what's even more unsettling, how Ed Gein's twisted life and crimes became a blueprint for some of the most chilling figures in horror history.
So let's start with one of the most obvious connections, Psycho. Alfred Hitchcock's landmark film introduced the world to Norman Bates, a character whose mother complex and psychotic tendencies mirrored Gein's own. While Bates wasn't a direct representation of Ed, the similarities are undeniable. Gein's obsession with his mother, his later attempts to become her, and the horrific acts he committed to preserve her memory and are reflected in Bates' own twisted motivations.
Okay, and then there's the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a film that gave us the infamous Leatherface. Though Leatherface's backstory was fictionalized, his character was heavily inspired by Gein. Leatherface, like Ed, wore human skin, and the grotesque family of cannibals that surrounded him echoed Gein's own isolated, strange existence. The idea of a house of horrors filled with grotesque trophies, such as a skin mask and body parts as decor, was directly drawn from the Gein case.
But it doesn't stop with just one or two characters. Gein's influence ripples throughout pop culture, with some of the most iconic villains pulling from his dark legacy. The Silence of the Lambs gave us Buffalo Bill, a character who takes Gein's fascination with skinning and makes it part of the psychotic ritual. Buffalo Bill's use of human skin for clothing, specifically creating a woman's suit, is eerily similar to Gein's own bizarre attempts to transform himself into his mother.
And it doesn't just stop in the world of film. Ed Gein's name has found its way into books. Too. Writers like Stephen King and Robert Bloch have drawn heavily on his life for inspiration. In fact, Bloch, the author of Psycho, said that he was influenced by Ed Gein's gruesome crimes, which were heavily publicized in the late 1950s. King, meanwhile, weaves elements of Gein into his work, often exploring the psychosis and twisted relationships seen in characters who embody the same obsession with death and transformation.
In music, Ed Gein's influence is equally strong. Bands in genres like metal and industrial have often referenced his story, his name, his crimes, as part of a larger cultural fascination with the grotesque and the macabre. The song Ed Gein by the band The Murder Dolls is a prime example where the lyrics dive deep into the legacy of his gruesome acts, solidifying his place in the minds of those who gravitate towards horror-inspired music.
Ed Gein has also become a symbol in the world of true crime documentaries, podcasts, like this one, and books. His case continues to fascinate new generations thanks to the unsettling complexity of his psychology. It is not just about the horrific acts themselves. It's about what drives a person to commit such unspeakable acts. It is about the mystery of Gein's mind that continues to spark debate among criminologists and amateur sleuths alike.
And while Gein's legacy is rooted in real-life horror, it's his almost mythological status in popular culture that keeps his name alive. Ed Gein wasn't just a killer. He became a symbol of something darker, something inexplicable. His name is a shorthand for the most extreme and twisted elements of the human psyche. He represents that place in our minds where fascination with the macabre meets pure horror.
What's truly terrifying is the realization that the line between fiction and reality is much thinner than we would like to think. Gein, who became the stuff of nightmares, was a real person. His life and crimes were not born from some horror writer's imagination, but from the depth of an actual human mind, a mind that still holds a strange fascination for so many today.
In a sense, Gein's pop culture legacy keeps his monstrous presence alive in our imaginations, even as he lies buried in Plainfield. Each movie, book, and song that references him perpetuates his aura of horror, ensuring that his name is never forgotten, even as we try to distance ourselves from his crimes.
Now, let's not forget the chilling reality that Ed Gein is still relevant in contemporary discussions about mental illness, violence, and psychology of crime. His name often comes up in criminology classes, and his case is frequently studied by psychologists trying to understand the nature of obsession, trauma, and psychosis.
From horror to real-world discussions, Ed Gein's legacy is woven into the very fabric of our cultural understanding of fear. His twisted story has left an indelible mark that haunts us, an example of how the grotesque and the human collide in ways that we can't always comprehend.
And perhaps that's the most terrifying thing of all. The truth behind Ed Gein's life and crimes is more bizarre and chilling than anything fiction could ever dream up. And that, my friends, is why Ed Gein will always have a place in our nightmares. Now, before we get into our closing thoughts here real quick, we've probably talked about this on a previous episode when we visited Zach Bagan's Haunted Museum. I know you and your brother Devio went at one point in time. About a week later, I went with Brandy.
Ding.
Ding. Got to get the bell in there. And then you and I went together when we went to the Paranormal Convention in 2021. And in Zach Bagan's museum there was an entire room dedicated to Ed Gein. He had some of the stuff that we didn't mention in the show. So he had the nipple belt. Ed Gein made a belt out of people's nipples, most likely women's, because that's what he dug up. He also had that cauldron looking thing, the pot
that he tanned and he cooked his skins in.
So he has a big plexiglass case around this pot. But I remember, and I'm sure this room is still there if you want to go to Zach Bagan's museum there in Vegas. But I remember the intense energy that came off of this thing. That room was probably for me one of the hardest rooms to be in because of all of the crazy ass energy on his stuff. I don't know how it was for you.
I wasn't feeling that. I saw it impacted you, but no, I didn't.
I've ever since I learned about Ed Gein, I've just been kind of fascinated by this guy, which is why I chose this topic.
You were just fangirling in there.
I was actually. I was like, oh my gosh, it's the Ed Gein stuff.
It's the pot.
It's the pot. I didn't know that. So Zach has this weird way of just finding stuff that belonged to these notorious people, right? And like I said, he had it made up to look like Ed Gein's barn.
Yeah. And
he had so much stuff. I will post a picture of this on our social media, but I actually do own something I bought at the Oddities and Curiosity Expo a couple years back. A human nipple. No, actually. Close though. I have a placard that has Ed Gein's photo in it. It has a copy of his birth certificate, a copy of I think his death certificate, a picture of his headstone before it was stolen, and copies of his fingerprints. So I've got some actual Ed Gein memorabilia at my house right now. Mm-hmm. I bet you're jealous.
You don't got nipples. I don't want to hear about it.
I have my nipples.
If you have more than two, that's what.
Okay, I don't have more than two. I'm sorry.
All right, closing thoughts. As we close out tonight's episode, we can't help but reflect on the enduring darkness that is Ed Gein. What started as a tragic, isolated upbringing became a nightmare that still echoes through our culture and minds today. From his disturbing crimes to the psychological complexities that drove them, Gein remains one of the most terrifying figures in American history.
And it is important to remember that behind the macabre and the horror, Ed Gein was a real person, a human being who, for whatever reason, was shaped by the darkest of circumstances. His relationship with his mother, his isolation, and the trauma of his life all conspired to create something far beyond what most of us truly comprehend. It's easy to label someone like Gein as just a monster, but when you dig deeper, you start to see how the mind, influenced by abuse and loss, can create unspeakable horrors.
And while we may never fully understand the why behind his actions, what we do know is that the repercussions of his crimes rippled through both the real world and the realm of fiction. From Psycho to Texas Chainsaw, his twisted legacy was found its way into every corner of popular culture. Yet despite all that, the story of Ed Gein is never fully detached from the chilling reality that his crimes were not simply stories, they were real.
It's a reminder that sometimes the most disturbing things are the ones that are closest to us. The line between the horrific legends we watch in movies and the actual events of real life is often much thinner than we're comfortable acknowledging. Gein's actions were not just the product of fiction. They were born from a very rare, very real, very damaged mind. And the scariest thing is that the mind that created these horrors was not entirely alien to us. Holy hell. It was human.
So, as you lay your head down tonight, remember, the real monsters are often the ones who walk among us. The ones with twisted minds, cloaked in normalcy. And while we can escape into fiction, the memories of Ed Gein's crimes still hang in the air. The whispers of horrors that surround his name and his story are hard to shake. Whether it's the paranormal presence in Plainfield or the psychological aftermath of his crimes, the legacy of Ed Gein isn't something that just fades away.
And maybe that's the part of the draw. Maybe that's why people are still captivated by Gein, because his story is a reminder that sometimes horror doesn't just exist in supernatural. Sometimes it exists in the most human parts of our mind, in the real-life, twisted narratives we can't help but want to understand.
And as we wrap up, we leave you with a thought to ponder. How much of the horror we fear is truly out of our control? And how much of it is rooted in something disturbingly human? Ed Gein's life and legacy continue to be a reminder that the scariest things might not always be ghosts or spirits, but the dark, twisted corners of our own minds.
Now, if you have got your own theories about Ed Gein, or if you've experienced anything strange in Wisconsin's backwoods, we want to hear from you.
Email us at evp.pod@gmail.com or hit us up on our social medias. You can find us on Instagram or Facebook at evp.pod.
Now, don't forget to follow, rate, and share the show. It keeps the paranormal flowing and the EVPs coming in loud and clear.
So next time on the EVP Podcast, we're diving into another tale where the line between the living and the dead gets disturbingly thin.
Until then, keep your recorders on, your doors locked, and remember,
Ghosts don't play that.
Peace out, butterflies.
This is the EVP Podcast.